2024 was a bit of a weird year for NXT call-ups to the main roster, wasn't it? Because the WWE seemed to be all over the place with how they were using, or in some cases straight up just not using, NXT talent that they themselves called up to the main roster. You had some call-ups that in year one would win championship gold, major singles accolades, would debut at WrestleMania, while some would struggle to find any sort of relevant TV time, and some got called up to just straight up get fired. So in today's video, we're going to look at every single NXT call-up that we saw in 2024 to the main roster, and we're going to give them a letter grade based on how good or how bad they were used in 2024. And as always, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, ring the bell for notifications. If you're a wrestling fan, I'm confident that you're going to fall in love with this YouTube channel because we always upload daily wrestling content. And don't forget, if you want even more daily wrestling content, to come check out the Patreon, patreon.com/SantiZap. Over there, we upload so much more extra content that never gets uploaded to YouTube. Come check it out, patreon.com/SantiZap. Link in the description, link in the pinned comment. Let's start. Let's start things off by talking about Baron Corbin. And as somebody that became a huge Baron Corbin fan during his second time in NXT, it was incredibly sad and frustrating to see how he was handled upon his call-up to the main roster again. In case you didn't know, Baron Corbin was sent down to NXT after years of being on the main roster. And in NXT, he went back to an old version of that lone wolf character that he had in his original NXT run. And honestly, it was awesome. His second run in NXT was fantastic. It was a renaissance of his career. I think most wrestling fans that watch Baron Corbin in NXT were just excited about the prospect of getting this version of Baron Corbin getting called up to the main roster because it seemed like the ceiling was incredibly high for this second run. And in NXT, Baron Corbin showed so much versatility as both a comedic act, as a dangerous heel, as a babyface, as a heel. He played pretty much every single role and he played it incredibly well. So I don't think it's a shock when so many of us had our expectations incredibly high to see Baron Corbin's second run when he was called up in the draft up to Friday Night SmackDown. But immediately upon him getting called up, you just knew that this was gonna go nowhere. He struggled to find any sort of TV time. The TV time that he did get was kind of relegated to being like not even B or C or D tier, but like F-tier storylines on Friday Night SmackDown. The partnership with Apollo Crews was interesting and people wanted to see what these two could do, but WWE never really allowed those two to flourish in any significant fashion. And again, it's a shame because we saw what Baron Corbin was capable upon his second run in NXT. He was great on the mic, great in the ring, great all around, and we didn't get to see any of that upon his second run on the main roster. Not only would he disappear from TV, but then he just wouldn't get re-signed and was part of releases later in 2024. So honestly, I have no choice but to go with an F for Baron Corbin. And I love Baron Corbin. It's just that the way that he was used in 2024 upon his call-up was just frankly awful. Now let's talk about Blair Davenport. The Blair Davenport situation is interesting because when people were getting called up to the main roster, I thought that Blair Davenport should stay in NXT and she should be one of the top heels in the women's NXT division. With NXT having recently lost people like Tiffany Stratton, I really felt like somebody like Blair Davenport, somebody that had years in the business, could really slide into that top heel role in NXT and maybe potentially even win a women's NXT championship. On top of that, before she got called up, there were already rumors circulating that NXT was going to introduce a brand new women's mid-card belt, the Women's North American Championship. And so many fans of Blair Davenport and NXT believe that she would have been perfect for that role. But instead, she was called up. And I'm going to be honest with you, I was cautiously optimistic about Blair Davenport's time in the main roster because I was a big fan of her on NXT. Unfortunately, what we've gotten of Blair Davenport on the main roster just has been a shell of herself, both from a character standpoint and from an in-ring standpoint. I don't think that we've gotten that great Blair Davenport match on the main roster, and I can actually point to several really good Blair Davenport matches on NXT. So it feels like she's missing a step, like she's a bit nerfed both physically and as a character as well. Well, from the character point of view, it's hard to really build anything when you barely get any sort of relevant TV time. She had disappeared seemingly for months to appear in the Women's US Championship tournament bracket, to lose in the first round, and she's disappeared once again. So it almost feels like they only use Blair Davenport when they need an excess of bodies for something like a tournament. For me, it's fingers crossed in 2025 for Blair Davenport, because SmackDown will be going to 3 hours, and the individuals that could benefit from that extra hour could be people like the Blair Davenports of the world. But as it stands, her 2024 was not great, but at least she's still in the company. That's more than I can say for Baron Corbin. So I will give Blair Davenport a D for Davenport. Now let's talk about Kiana James. Kiana James was a really interesting case. I feel like most people were shocked when she was drafted to the main roster as part of the NXT call-up wave. This was an individual that felt like they were still getting better in NXT, like they still needed time to hone their craft and hone their skills, and they were slowly progressing in NXT. So having her get called up to the main roster kind of shocked everybody. Again, at this time, NXT was in a bit of a shortage of heels in the women's division, and having people like Blair Davenport, like Tiffany Stratton, get moved away from NXT would have opened up a good opportunity for somebody like Kiana James to continue her development in the developmental of WWE. So I don't think it's crazy that a lot of people thought that her call-up was just entirely way too quick and rushed, because frankly, I think that it was. And WWE has more or less proven that, because they called her up. They had absolutely nothing for her whatsoever. She would appear in a couple of matches in main event, but that's about it. She had a Dead on Arrival storyline where she tried to be the assistant and executive director to Adam Pearce. That went absolutely nowhere. And then she unfortunately would go on to get injured. Obviously, injuries happen. That's part of the business, right? Like, I would never hold an injury against somebody, but everything that was leading up before the injury was just really bad for Kiana James. I feel like people are going to get behind this one. I don't think that this is a controversial letter grade. I have to give Kiana James's usage in 2024 as an NXT call-up to the main roster an F here. Now let's talk about one of the most wasted opportunities, Dijak. Look, I've always been very vocal. I fucking love Dijak. Everything that he did during his time in NXT was absolutely fantastic in my opinion. And kind of similar to Baron Corbin, he went back to NXT. He kind of rediscovered himself. He reminded the world how good he is in the ring and found a new character that a lot of people kind of connected with. So even though his first run in the main roster didn't exactly land, in case you didn't know, he was T-Bar of Retribution. And to be fair, of course it didn't land because it's fucking Retribution. There was a lot of optimism upon his second arrival on the main roster because, similar to Baron Corbin, he rediscovered something special about the Dijak being, the Dijak character, and introduced it again to the world in NXT, and people were excited to see this on the main roster. And there was a lot of optimism with his return to the main roster because this was a main roster that was being now led by Triple H, not Vince McMahon. And when you look at his time in NXT Black and Gold, where he became one of those darlings of NXT Black and Gold, it was also being run by Triple H. So a lot of people just sort of felt like, hey, he was used well in NXT under Triple H, and hopefully he'll get used really well in the main roster under Triple H as well. But that didn't end up being the case because he didn't get used at all. Funny enough, I think that Dijak 100% should have stayed in NXT. He would have been perfect there because Trick Williams had just been crowned the new NXT champion, and Dijak would have been a perfect first opponent, a perfect first feud for the new champion who lost his major rivals in both Carmelo Hayes and Elia Dragonov to call-ups. But they called him up to the main roster. They didn't use him. They used him for a couple speed matches and main event matches, but that's it. Then he just wasn't re-signed and left the WWE. So to no surprise, I also have to give how Dijak was used in 2024 an F. Now let's talk about Carmelo Hayes. Carmelo Hayes is seen by many as one of the crown jewels, the darlings of this wave of NXT crop that was called up to the main roster, and for obvious reason. Carmelo Hayes had a fantastic career in NXT, a career that showed that his ceiling was insanely high for the main roster. Not only was he called up, but if you remember, he was a first-round draft pick for Friday Night SmackDown, and his debut match was none other against the undisputed champion Cody frickin' Rhodes. So clearly there was a lot of optimism from WWE's part on how Carmelo Hayes would be received by main roster fans. I will say it feels like they've waned on this feeling because they've not given Carmelo Hayes as big of a platform as he had immediately from getting his call up to the main roster. He hasn't been feuding for any main roster titles, but he's had relevant feuds, storylines, TV time pretty much every single week. Honestly, it's a pretty solid first year all around when it comes to Carmelo Hayes. I think the only thing that's missing from Carmelo Hayes is like singles accolades, but even him not winning the US title or anything else like the King of the Ring, I still feel like the future is incredibly bright for Carmelo Hayes, even if he didn't get immediately catapulted like some other people did right to the tippity top. So I feel like Carmelo Hayes' 2024 all around on the main roster was solid. It wasn't perfect, but I feel like it was solid enough to leave a lot of optimism as we go into 2025. So I'm going to say that with Carmelo Hayes getting championship opportunities, getting relevant storylines, getting TV time every single week, getting plenty of time to demonstrate how good he is in the ring. Let's not forget that awesome best of 7 series with Andrade. I'm going to say B+ for Carmelo. Larra Valkyrie, let's talk about her next. So out of all of the women that were called up as part of the draft, I feel like there was the most amount of optimism and the most amount of just an overall feeling that this is a future main eventer for Larra Valkyrie. And it started off really strong with her making it all the way to the final of the Queen of the Ring tournament and debuting on a major PLE, fighting for a major singles accolade, fighting for a #1 contendership at a SummerSlam championship match. That was a huge, great start for Larra Valkyrie, which, by the way, that tournament run of hers included what I think is a match of the year contender against Io Sky. But it seems like after the Queen of the Ring stuff, they just had nothing for her. And she kind of disappeared from our screens for a really long time, to the point where they sent her back to NXT to have a storyline with Tatum Paxley over there because they were just kind of wasting away Larra Valkyrie. And funny enough, once they needed another relevant figure to step back in, they brought back Larra Valkyrie for the Women's Intercontinental Championship tournament, and she is one of the favorites to win it. As of the making of this video, we don't know who's going to win this tournament, but I feel like Larra Valkyrie has to be damn near the top for most people's guesses and predictions. And that's honestly really impressive. The fact that she can still be considered such a strong contender for this inaugural Women's Intercontinental Championship, even after months of not using her, just goes to show that fans still just have a lot of respect and a lot of overall optimism about Larra Valkyrie. But this could have been better. This could have been an A. This could have been a B+. This could have been a really strong letter grade had it not been for the months of hiatus that WWE put her on after being called up and after that run to the final of the Women's Queen of the Ring. So I'm going to give Larra Valkyrie a B, but damn it, dude, this should have been higher. Now let's talk about Elia Dragonov. It almost feels like WWE was willing to be the most patient with pushing Elia Dragonov out of any of the other main event worthy NXT call-ups that they had. And I almost feel like they were patient because they know that Elia Dragonov can deliver in pretty much any single setting. He doesn't need to be immediately portrayed as this main event guy, because at any moment you could just snap your fingers and say, yep, he's a main event guy, and pretty much everyone would nod their head in agreement. So because of this, it just sort of felt like they took too much time with Elia Dragonov, and they used Elia Dragonov to make other people look strong, to make other people look successful, like Braun Breaker, like Jey Uso, and we didn't really get the opportunity to have Elia Dragonov himself look amazing. He looked strong in all of his defeats, that's for sure, but they didn't really feel like they needed to make him into the winner of all of his feuds and his matches, because even in defeat, people still had a lot of love and respect and admiration for the work of Elia Dragonov. Funny enough, it felt like after a little bit of a hiatus that they were finally ready to do something with Elia Dragonov, but unfortunately he was injured, and that injury derailed whatever it is that they were planning for Elia Dragonov. But Elia Dragonov was missing like significant storylines. He was part of matches, #1 contendership tournaments, etc., and great matches, don't get me wrong. But aside from the story that he started to develop with Braun Breaker, where frankly, he wasn't even the main focal point of that story. It was to develop Braun Breaker and Sami Zayn in the long term. It just felt like there was nothing of substance for stories with Elia Dragonov. It looked like they were maybe going to lead into something with the Judgment Day, but again, injuries happened and we didn't get to see what that ended up being. But based at the very least on his great matches, the great showings in his matches, I'm going to give Elia Dragonov's usage in 2024 a C. Did you forget? I mean, Odyssey Jones technically was an NXT call-up in 2024, even though he was part of the draft years ago. But he made his debut on the main roster, frickin' finally on Monday Night Raw as part of the New Day's storyline. And within 2 weeks of being on the main roster, he screwed everything up with domestic abuse allegations and has now been fired from the WWE and is nowhere to be seen. So, I mean, this is pretty easy. I'm going to give it a nap. Tyler Bate. You might have forgotten that this is technically an NXT call-up. He was called up well before the WWE draft, as he was called up to be Butch's or Pete Dunne's tag team partner at SmackDown's New Year's Revolution, the first episode of SmackDown of 2024. So he literally just makes the cut. He made his appearance on the main roster the first available day of 2024. You know what? All things considered for Tyler Bate, it wasn't the bad 2024. The only thing that really derailed it is the fact that he got injured and he's been off television for a really long time. I feel like the Tyler Bate fans would also tell you that it wasn't a great 2024 because he was pretty much shackled to the tag team division and didn't really get to showcase what he's capable of as a single star like he was in NXT UK or NXT Black and Gold. But if you think about it, the dude got to be part of a couple of PLEs. He was at Elimination Chamber and he was also in WrestleMania 40. So he got to make his WrestleMania debut upon his first year on the main roster. That's not bad. And he had some really fun tag team matches, but we know that there's just still so much more untapped potential with the big, strong boy, Tyler Bate. Tap potential that just wasn't really utilized in 2024. So at best, what I can do for Tyler Bate is I would say a C+ in terms of how he was used in 2024. Braun Breaker. I mean, this is the guy, right? Braun Breaker was called up to the main roster even before he was fully out of NXT. He was called up to the main roster while still being a tag team champion down in NXT, and he was called up well before the NXT draft. But it's very clear that this is the next guy for the WWE. Not only is he one of the top guys right now with being the Intercontinental Champion, but to me, this is a guy that they're going to be putting world championships left, right, and center, singles accolades like Money in the Bank, King of the Rings, Royal Rumble. This dude's future is insanely bright. And 2024 really demonstrated that with how he was booked and just overall utilized throughout the year in his matches and in his storyline. Not only was he given the opportunity to have great matches and showcase how much of a beast he is in the ring, but he's also been showcased heavily on the microphone as well with in-ring promos or backstage segments. Overall, I don't think that it can get better with how you're being utilized as an NXT rookie than it's been 2024 for Braun Breaker. It's been a great year for him. So for Braun Breaker, let's just keep it simple here. It's an A+. Tiffany Stratton was kind of like the other side of the coin. It was like Tiffany Stratton and Braun Breaker, the two big names that you just knew WWE saw big money and big potential over the next decade plus. And similar to Braun Breaker, it was immediately shown that there is a lot of trust for Tiffany Stratton, and she was immediately inserted into major feuds and storylines, like being part of the Women's Elimination Chamber match and being part of a amazing women's triple threat match at Backlash, winning the Money in the Bank briefcase, and being consistently inserted in main event storylines and feuds like how she currently is with Nia Jax and company. Her time as Miss Money in the Bank has been obviously lackluster. I've been very vocal about this on this channel, and so have many of you, but that's not going to really sway too much of my opinion. Her usage in 2024 has been fantastic. I'm going to go with an A-. The only reason it's not an A+ is because she hasn't won the big one or any major championships yet. The Money in the Bank briefcase has the potential to give her a championship, but we haven't gotten to that level yet. Technically, we can talk about most of Legato Del Fantasma because we had Elektra Lopez, Angel Garza, and Berto all get called up from NXT. And they've been fine. They play their role fine, but they've not really been given the chance to do anything too special as of yet. But when they do get a chance in ring, I think pretty much everyone is always left in shock and awe how good these guys can actually be. And we even got to see Elektra in the ring as part of the Women's United States Championship tournament, so that was pretty cool. Sure, Alicia Taylor, she was the NXT commentator and became the Friday Night SmackDown commentator in 2024. I guess that this is entirely subjective. Like, what do you even consider a good year for a ring announcer? I mean, to me, a good year is getting called up from NXT to be the ring announcer for one of the flagship shows of the biggest wrestling company on the planet. So going from NXT, the little arena, to arenas all over the world on Friday Night SmackDown, I'd say that's a pretty damn good year for Alicia Taylor. She gets an A. Here's one that maybe some of you forgot is technically an NXT call-up. Joe Gase of the Wyatt Six. It's tough to give Joe Gase an individual letter grade for his performance because he's part of a larger performative act that is the Wyatt Six. But holy shit, the debut of the Wyatt Six, which in turn includes the debut of Joe Gase, is one of the coolest things that I've ever seen the WWE do. I really think it's one of the coolest, best produced things in general that I've seen ever. He was part of the feud with American Made, currently feuding with Karrion Kross's Final Testament, so he's appearing on there, although of course he's just not a focal point of the storylines that he's a part of because he's just not the leader of the group. But I mean, overall, if I'm Joe Gase, like, I'm happy with how I'm being utilized as a member of a faction. I'll go with B. But that's it, folks. You guys let me know if you feel like you disagree with some of my letter grades. This is what the comment section is for, but that's it. Okay. All right. Bye. I'm done. Get out of here.